Reconciliation Day this year is reaffirming reconciliation for future generations. As you know, government holding that big event in KwaZulu-Natal. If you look at our history, you can see reconciliation can be different in many ways, but also, as a society, many people in more and more places are living together and working together and learning together in so many different ways. Dr. Saths Cooper is an anti-apartheid activist and a clinical psychologist. Dr. Cooper, good morning to you and thank you for your time this public holiday. Our society, I suppose, is going through a series of really big transitions, a process of transformation, for example. We want to grow our economy. How do you think we can go about ensuring that future generations, I don't know if the right phrase is more reconciled, maybe I should say less troubled than we are?
Well, I think the journey of creating a nation and the attempt to reconcile what probably is at its worst level right now is a mission that we cannot afford to lose sight of. We need that so that all the issues that we do confront are not repeated with future generations. To do that, we need to be very clear about our history. We need to actually let the facts, not interpretation, emerge, because all around us from various quarters, including, unfortunately, in our schooling system, we get interpretations. The facts are sufficiently weighty to speak for themselves. So we know that 185 years ago, Mpande ceded to the throne of the House of Amazulu, and with the support of one of the leaders of the Battle of Bloedrivier, and that's Pretorius. And we know also, ironically, that that part of the country is probably the most fractured in the entire country. While we have huge contestations, like in Johannesburg, where you and I are in, that province just had an ugly scene yesterday by officials and parliamentarians that our kids, our future, our generations now don't need to see the ugliness of. Surely we can agree to disagree without the kinds of boorishness and violent behavior that we see all around us. Then it becomes very rich when we engage in these campaigns, 16 days of no violence, etc., 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 because we haven't come to terms with the fact that the basis of creating South Africa was one of colonial conquest, land dispossession, and now we're stuck with precedents that base all these on the advent of South Africa in 2010 rather than the pre-colonial era. So all that said, we also act as different ethnicities, different beliefs, and if we thought apartheid is dead, the apartheid of the mind is overwhelming.
I do want to go back a little bit. You made an interesting point about being South African, creating a nation. And I sometimes wonder, one of the ways to sort of evaluate this is to go and ask people, what are you? You describe yourself. And at what point do they say South African, and at what point do they say I am Zulu, or I am Afrikaans, or I am Xhosa, or I am black, or Indian, or coloured, or white? And I suppose my question then is, how do we make people feel South African before they feel any of the other elements of their identity?
Well, that's the last point, is the nub of the issue. In all that we do, in media, in other public spaces, and we are carriers of bringing people together, we should be looking at our commonness. And let's be very clear, Stephen, our biology is the same. But the othering continues, the name calling and the classification system just injures human dignity. So in effect, it violates our Bill of Rights provisions, which places high store on dignity. Instead, the indignity of having to be called whatever by whoever. So if you ask ordinary people, they will come with a variety of ways. But you cannot be a language, you cannot be an ethnicity, you cannot be a class or a caste alone, you cannot be a political or religious belief. You have to be a human being attempting to create common humanity with all of those people that we have to engage with. It is that which brings us together as a human family. And on the southern tip of Africa, we had that opportunity in the heady days of democracy 35 years ago, but that has slowly waned and been overtaken by the worst kinds of narrow ethnicity, tribal sloganeering, and political grandstanding that becomes violent in turn. So I think that we need to have an education system that exposes facts of our history. So on this day, there was the ousting, very bloody, at Ntome River by Andres, by Pretorius and Cilliers, and Dingane was overthrown. Mpande assumed that role 2 years later. But you see, the history is not put out in that fashion, because at noon today, Afrikaner diehards will gather at Voortrekker Hoogte and see the light shine in the middle of the monument there and feel very special. All of us are special, but we don't need to diminish the dignity of anybody else in expressing our own specialness.
When I hear certain people in our society, they make me feel South African. And let me give you a few examples. Normally, when I hear Siya Kolisi, Bronwyn Williams, or Temba Bavuma, our sporting captains, our men's sporting captains, I suppose I should say, speak, I get a sense that they're speaking for the whole country. There are other people who, when they speak, you can see they're speaking kind of to the whole country, and they'll make you feel South African. But the voices of those who will make you feel something else, black, white, of the Islamic faith, Christian, whatever. It seems to me that they're growing, and it seems to me that this is related to the fact that the ANC, the only political party which ever tried to compete for the votes of everybody, is getting weaker. And does that suggest, perhaps, that the voices that want us to fracture are just going to get louder over the next few years?
I think that momentum is a reality. We're going to see more of it in the new year when we go to local government elections. But I think it's the failed project of the ANC that talked non-something. And when you talk non-something, you're not affirming people. An anti-racist, a vigorous anti-violent, anti-sectarian position is required in this country. Because if you and I talk, I can't describe Stephen Grootes as a non-laptop that I'm looking at. I have to describe you as a human being, and then however else you want to be affirmed. But that affirmation only comes through appropriate socialization and education, both of which we don't have in our country, because we are riven with sectarianism, we're riven with racism that we haven't shed 30 plus years after democracy. We haven't dealt with these underpinnings that make our society the most violent without a war. So that, plus all the exclusions, the majority don't vote. There is no attempt by our democracy to get young people to be at the voting stations and to get them automatically registered. Indeed, we have a flawed political system. So every day and on the airwaves, we hear people talking about vote differently. But do we realize that we're actually not voting for people? We're voting for parties. A flawed system that was interim in 94, that was made permanent despite commission after commission, including the one 2 years ago, that said this system leads to corruption, leads to the confusion and the violence perpetuating itself, and importantly, excluding the majority from participation in that democracy that is quite weak at this stage.
There are so many things, so I completely agree with you. While people are speaking, while the big voices in our society are sort of almost driving us apart, more and more people, and this is probably more a middle-class phenomenon than anywhere else, more and more people with different histories are living together. And the economy, which kind of created South Africa, I mean, would be so different if there hadn't been first diamonds and then gold discovered. But we are seeing more people from families with very different histories living together, and particularly, again, through the economy, working together. Now they're working together in different ways. And if you look at boardrooms and JSE-listed companies, you'll see, unfortunately, they look, I suppose, Dr. Cooper, they look really like me. And so the fact that people are spending time together, does that help?
It does, but it's merely the tip of the iceberg. This is, as you said, it's a bourgeois phenomenon. It's middle class and those who have that ability. For the vast majority, the scarred landscape of apartheid remains. The horizon doesn't go higher than being restricted to Katlehong, being restricted to KwaMashu, being restricted to another labor colony that has become a residential area with very little attempt to make them livable. With a few exceptions throughout the country, and Cape Town is a classic example. You have the Cape Flats, and then you have the bustling privileged. So we continue, and don't ignore that speech that Mbeki, probably his best, of I'm an African and the two societies. And thereafter, he and others lost the plot. We don't deal with what our people want. And you'll be shocked at how little our people really want. They want safety. They want the ability to feed and to clothe and to educate their kids so that all that's braided in our democracy is accessible to their children, which it is not to the majority. Our stats are horrific. I mean, 30 children die from hunger. We call it malnutrition, malnourishment, and 1/5 of the children born are born stunted. And that becomes a drain. So we're creating, inbred in our, it's like the apartheid system. The democratic one confirmed and layered that to where it is now, so we can walk past somebody lying on the street. We can walk past the stench, the potholes that we see and think it's normalcy. It's the potholes of the mind that we need to be aware of.
I suppose from what you're saying, we're probably always going to need a reconciliation day. And I mean, the Day of Reconciliation, the history of it, of course, some of it you've mentioned. I suppose really when the people who drew up the Constitution and included public holidays were thinking primarily about race. And as long as we have racialized inequality, race is going to be the fundamental factor. I mean, our society might change in unexpected ways, I suppose, it's possible. Do you think we're always going to need a reconciliation day? And I say that knowing that the vast majority of people are probably spending the day doing something else other than thinking about reconciliation because it's the start of the festive season.
True. However, if we put the emphasis not on talking heads like we get on these public holidays and spend money that really is misspent, we should be starting with kindergarten, creche education. We should be focusing on that, not making that something that's an add-on. It's fundamental to our children's growth, and the history that's taught has to be factual, not interpreted. The interpretation will happen in the interaction, and people will contest it. And that's good for our democracy, so that through contestation, you can come to agreement, you find common purpose. And the lowest common denominator now seems to be that which is very violent, which is the easiest we are reacting to. And we leave aside mindfulness, using our brains, using common sense, and importantly, that agency that we've lost. We need to restore the agency to ourselves, because you recall, newsrooms were flush with excitement. Now we chase the latest saga of detriment, of attack, of sloganeering, and the latest shock to tell us who's been outed through corruption or something like that. We're not presenting the commonness. Days like this need to be ones where there are examples, living examples in places that we live in. And let me be very frank also. During democracy, community, the sense of community has been destroyed. The only places they exist is on occasions like this when people get together. Other than that, there isn't a community of purpose, besides faith-based and political belief communities. Other than that, physically, communities have been destroyed. We need to look at upgrading, normalizing, and investing in people so that our kids don't grow up in filth, squalor, and believe it is democracy. Because if that is the democracy, then something else is going to take its place.
Dr. Saths Cooper, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time, sir.